In late 2000, a woman was found dead in her Los Angeles home, and the details immediately resisted simple explanation. The scene raised questions that did not align neatly with accident or chance. A brief message arrived at police before the discovery, precise in wording, yet unclear in meaning. Connections existed, but none were openly acknowledged. Evidence was present, though its significance was not yet agreed upon. What followed was not swift resolution, but a long stretch of uncertainty shaped by procedure, restraint, and unanswered responsibility. The story begins with what was known at the start, and with what could not yet be proven, as investigators documented facts that would remain unchanged even as understanding evolved. If careful reporting and patient explanation matter to you, subscribe for more documentaries grounded in verified records and methodical inquiry. Susan Berman was found deceased inside her Benedict Canyon residence in December 2000. Law enforcement responded after receiving a handwritten note addressed to police that indicated a body would be found at the location. Officers entered the home and confirmed that Susan Berman had died from a gunshot wound to the back of the head. The position of her body and the nature of the injury led investigators to determine that the death involved a criminal act rather than natural causes. The scene was secured and processed according to standard procedure. Investigators documented the interior of the residence, noting the absence of forced entry and the general condition of the space. Personal items were present, and there were no immediate signs of a struggle. These observations were recorded without interpretation, as early assessments focused on preservation rather than theory. Attention quickly centered on the handwritten note. The wording was brief and direct, providing an address and stating that a body was located there. Investigators examined the note for fingerprints, handwriting characteristics, and other trace evidence. At the time, the note was treated as an unusual element rather than definitive proof of involvement by any individual. Its role would be evaluated alongside other findings. Susan Berman's background was reviewed through official records and public information. She was known to have long-standing associations with individuals who had drawn prior law enforcement attention in unrelated matters. These associations were documented but not treated as conclusions. Investigators remained focused on what could be established through evidence rather than reputation or history. The medical examination confirmed the cause of death and helped narrow the window in which it occurred. This information guided early investigative steps, including efforts to determine who may have had contact with Susan Berman in the days preceding her death. Records were reviewed, and individuals connected to her recent activities were identified for follow-up. Despite the seriousness of the findings, no immediate arrest followed. The evidence collected at the scene did not produce a clear suspect. The handwritten note, while striking, required careful analysis before any attribution could be made. Investigators avoided drawing inferences beyond what the facts supported. Law enforcement documented the relationship between Susan Berman and Robert Durst as part of background review. This connection was known publicly and was included in investigative records. At that stage, it was noted without assigning responsibility. Investigators distinguished between documented association and evidence linking someone directly to the death. As initial steps concluded, the investigation settled into a measured pace. Reports were completed. Evidence was logged and preserved. The findings established what had occurred inside the residence, but not who was responsible. The discoveries set the framework for an inquiry defined by careful handling of facts, one that would remain unresolved for years, shaped by the limits of what could be proven at the time. The first days after Susan Berman was found focused on establishing a factual foundation rather than drawing conclusions. Investigators concentrated on what could be verified through records, physical evidence, and documented procedure. The scene had already been secured, and attention now turned to understanding how the circumstances inside the residence aligned with known facts about her life and recent activity. Officers reviewed the layout of the home in detail. The lack of forced entry suggested that whoever entered had either been allowed inside or had a means of access that did not disturb doors or windows. This observation was noted carefully, without attaching explanation. Investigators understood that absence of damage does not establish familiarity, only that entry occurred without obvious disruption. The handwritten note received by police remained a central element of inquiry. Investigators examined how and when it was delivered, confirming the timing relative to the discovery of the body. The wording was evaluated for clarity rather than implication. Analysts focused on its physical characteristics, including paper type, writing instrument, and trace material. At this stage, the note was treated as evidence that required cautious handling, not as a narrative device. Forensic work continued alongside this review. The medical findings confirmed that Susan Berman died from a gunshot wound to the back of the head, and that death occurred within a time frame consistent with when she was last known to be alive. This information narrowed the window investigators needed to examine. It did not identify who was present during that window. Investigators began reconstructing Susan Berman's recent movements using documented sources. Phone records, appointment information, and known communications were reviewed where available. The goal was to establish a defensible account of her last days without relying on speculation. Each verified contact was logged and evaluated in context. Background review formed part of this effort. Susan Berman's history, associations, and financial records were examined for relevance. She was known to have long-standing relationships with individuals who had drawn public attention in other matters. These connections were included in investigative files because they existed, not because they proved involvement. Investigators maintained a clear distinction between documented association and evidentiary linkage. Interviews were conducted with individuals who had interacted with her shortly before her death. Statements were recorded and compared for consistency. Some accounts helped clarify timing. Others added little beyond confirming known information. None provided direct evidence identifying responsibility. Law enforcement also assessed whether the death could be linked to other known violent deaths with superficial similarities. These comparisons were limited to factual overlap rather than thematic resemblance. No confirmed connection was established through this review. Evidence collected from the residence was cataloged and submitted for analysis where appropriate. Firearms evidence, trace material, and other items were evaluated according to standard forensic practice. Results did not produce an immediate suspect. This absence of early identification did not indicate failure. It reflected the complexity of the available information. Throughout this period, investigators documented each step carefully. Reports captured what was known, what had been examined, and what remained uncertain. Supervisors reviewed progress to ensure procedures were followed and that conclusions were not drawn prematurely. Despite the seriousness of the findings, the investigation did not move quickly toward arrest. The evidence did not yet support that action. The handwritten note, the scene observations, and background associations raised questions, but questions alone were not sufficient. As initial investigative work concluded, what remained was a detailed factual record. Susan Berman had been killed inside her home. A note had alerted police. The scene showed no forced entry. Associations existed but did not establish responsibility. The early investigation clarified boundaries rather than answers, setting the stage for a long period in which certainty remained out of reach, defined by evidence preserved and questions left unresolved. As the early investigation continued, one element remained difficult to place within standard patterns. Before Susan Berman's body was discovered, police had received a handwritten note informing them that a body would be found at her address. The note was brief, factual in tone, and specific about location. Its arrival preceded the discovery itself, creating an unusual starting point for law enforcement review. Investigators focused first on verification. They confirmed when the note was received, how it had been delivered, and which department handled it. Timing mattered. Establishing when the message entered police custody helped define its relevance in relation to the estimated time of death. Records were reviewed to confirm chain of receipt and handling. Attention then shifted to the physical characteristics of the note. Analysts examined the paper, the ink, and the handwriting. Fingerprints and trace material were sought using methods available at the time. These steps followed routine forensic practice, guided by the understanding that such material can provide exclusion as much as identification. Results did not immediately point to a specific individual. The wording of the note was also examined, though cautiously. Investigators avoided interpretive conclusions. The message contained no explanation, no signature, and no overt indication of motive or involvement. It stated only that a body was present at the listed address. Its clarity raised questions, but clarity alone was not evidence of responsibility. Handwriting analysis was conducted within accepted limits. Comparisons were possible only when reference samples existed and met quality standards. At that stage, no definitive match could be established. The note remained an object of interest without evidentiary certainty. Investigators considered alternative explanations consistent with documented facts. They assessed whether the note could have been sent by someone who had knowledge of the death without being responsible for it. They also considered whether the message could have been intended to direct police quickly rather than conceal information. These considerations were documented as possibilities rather than conclusions. The note's role within the investigation remained unsettled. It did not function as a confession. It did not provide detail beyond location. It did, however, demonstrate foreknowledge that police did not yet have. That foreknowledge was recorded as a fact requiring explanation at some point, even if no explanation was immediately available. Law enforcement maintained separation between the note and background associations already under review. While Susan Berman's connections were known, investigators avoided allowing those relationships to define interpretation of the note. Each element was handled independently to prevent circular reasoning. As time passed, the note was preserved alongside other evidence. Storage conditions were maintained to prevent degradation. Documentation accompanied it to ensure context remained intact. Its significance was not diminished by lack of immediate clarity. It remained part of the record, awaiting further information that might allow responsible interpretation. The absence of resolution did not lead to dismissal. Instead, the note became emblematic of the broader challenge facing investigators. It suggested knowledge without revealing source. It hinted at sequence without explaining cause. It raised questions that could not yet be answered through available tools. Investigators revisited the note periodically during early review phases. Each reassessment returned to the same boundaries. Without additional evidence, the note could not support arrest or charging. It remained a data point rather than a conclusion. The handling of the note reflected broader investigative restraint. Law enforcement documented what could be proven and left unresolved what could not. This approach prevented overreach and preserved credibility, even as public interest fluctuated. By the end of this stage of inquiry, the note occupied a defined place within the investigative file. It was neither ignored nor elevated beyond its evidentiary value. It stood as an unresolved element, preserved carefully, recorded accurately, and understood as something that would require future context to explain. The investigation continued forward without answers from the note. Its meaning was deferred rather than forced. In that restraint, investigators ensured that when new information eventually emerged, the note would remain intact, ready to be evaluated alongside facts not yet known. As investigators continued working within the limits of physical evidence, attention increasingly turned toward understanding Susan Berman's documented relationships. This did not replace forensic work. It complemented it. Context could not establish responsibility, but it could clarify why certain avenues required careful review and why others did not. Susan Berman had a long and well-documented relationship with Robert Durst that extended back decades. Records showed financial ties, personal contact, and periods of close association. These connections were not speculative. They were established through public records, correspondence, and later court documentation. Investigators included this history in their files because it existed, not because it answered the central question. The relationship was examined chronologically. Investigators reviewed when contact occurred, how frequently communication took place, and what form that communication took. They relied on verifiable information rather than recollection. This approach prevented distortion that can occur when relationships are interpreted through later events. Financial records formed part of this review. Transfers of money between Susan Berman and Robert Durst were documented in records available to investigators. These transactions were factual and traceable. Their existence did not establish motive or sequence, but it did establish ongoing connection that could not be ignored. Investigators also reviewed Susan Berman's role as a confidant. She had been publicly described as someone who possessed knowledge about past events connected to Robert Durst's life. These descriptions appeared in media reporting and were later addressed in court proceedings. At the time of the early investigation, they were noted as background rather than proof. Law enforcement took care to separate reputation from evidence. Susan Berman's associations with high-profile figures in past criminal matters were known publicly. Investigators documented these associations without allowing them to define conclusions. Context was recorded as context, not explanation. The timing of events also mattered. Investigators reviewed where Robert Durst was documented to be during the period surrounding Susan Berman's death. This review relied on records rather than assumption. Where documentation existed, it was included. Where it did not, absence was noted without inference. Communication records were examined where available. Phone activity, correspondence, and other documented contact were assessed to determine whether there had been recent interaction. These reviews helped establish proximity in time without establishing causation. Importantly, investigators resisted narrative construction. Relationships can suggest opportunity or relevance, but they do not substitute for evidence. This restraint shaped how the investigation proceeded. The focus remained on linking physical evidence to verifiable facts, rather than interpreting personal history as intent. As months passed, the relationship history remained part of the investigative file without resolution. It neither faded nor advanced the inquiry on its own. It existed as a constant background element, waiting for corroboration that did not yet appear. This careful handling reflected an understanding of how easily association can be mistaken for responsibility. Investigators documented what could be shown and avoided extrapolation. This approach preserved the integrity of the investigation during a period when public curiosity and media attention could have encouraged speculation. The context surrounding Susan Berman's relationships would later take on greater significance as additional information emerged. At this point, however, it functioned as background rather than driver. It explained why certain names appeared in files and why certain records were reviewed, but it did not provide answers. By maintaining this separation between context and conclusion, investigators ensured that the inquiry remained anchored to evidence. The relationship history was acknowledged without being overstated. It became part of the factual landscape surrounding Susan Berman's death, preserved carefully, awaiting developments that could clarify its relevance without forcing meaning before proof existed. As months passed without new evidence, the investigation entered a quieter and more constrained pattern. The early work had clarified what could be known, but it had not produced a path forward. Investigators continued to review existing material, not in search of new interpretation, but to confirm that nothing had been overlooked. Reports were reread, evidence inventories checked, and procedural steps verified. Each review returned the same result. The information available had already been exhausted within the limits of the time. The absence of forced entry, the handwritten note, and the documented relationships all remained relevant, but none could independently establish responsibility. Without corroborating physical evidence or reliable witness information, investigators could not move toward arrest. This restraint reflected legal standards rather than uncertainty. Action without proof would have compromised the integrity of the work already done. Evidence handling became a central concern. Items collected from the residence were preserved under controlled conditions. Chain of custody records were maintained carefully, ensuring that any future review would have a clear account of how material had been handled. This attention to detail was deliberate. Investigators understood that unresolved deaths sometimes depend on developments that arrive years later. Public attention began to fade. Without arrests or new findings, media coverage declined. This change altered the environment in which the investigation continued, but not its status. The inquiry remained open, though active pursuit slowed. Tips became infrequent. Information that did arrive could not be verified. Each submission was documented and assessed before being set aside. Supervisors periodically reviewed the investigation to determine whether new resources or approaches could change the outcome. These reviews considered staffing, forensic options, and emerging techniques. At that time, no method existed that could reinterpret the evidence in a meaningful way. The limitations were technological rather than procedural. Administrative classification followed established practice. The investigation was designated inactive, a status indicating reduced activity rather than closure. This allowed law enforcement to allocate resources elsewhere while preserving the ability to resume work if new information emerged. Responsibility for the file was clearly assigned to prevent loss of continuity. Documentation played a critical role during this period. Written records became the primary means through which the investigation endured. Photographs, laboratory notes, interview summaries, and evidence logs were preserved together to maintain context. This ensured that future review would not rely on memory or assumption. Investigators remained cautious in how the death was discussed internally. They avoided language that implied conclusions not supported by evidence. Susan Berman's death was treated as unresolved, not ambiguous. The difference mattered. Ambiguity invites speculation. Unresolved status reflects acknowledged limits. Over time, the lack of progress underscored broader realities about violent deaths investigated at the turn of the century. Forensic science had not yet reached a point where minimal or indirect evidence could reliably identify individuals. DNA databases were limited. Analytical tools were constrained. These realities shaped outcomes beyond any single investigation. Despite the slowdown, the work was not abandoned. Evidence remained secured, records remained intact. Periodic audits confirmed that material was accounted for, and storage conditions remained appropriate. This quiet maintenance ensured readiness rather than resolution. The investigation's pause did not change the facts already established. Susan Berman had been killed inside her home. A note had alerted police. Relationships existed that warranted attention. What was missing was proof that met legal standards. Until that proof could exist, responsibility could not be assigned. By the end of this stretch, the investigation existed in a suspended state, not closed, not active, but preserved. Its future depended on developments outside the immediate control of investigators. What remained was a disciplined record, protected carefully, waiting for a point when evidence and method might finally intersect in a way they had not yet been able to. Years passed without visible movement, yet the investigation did not disappear into storage. Files were retained, evidence remained cataloged, and responsibilities stayed assigned even as activity slowed. What changed over time was not the material itself, but the broader investigative environment surrounding unresolved violent deaths from earlier decades. Law enforcement agencies began reassessing older investigations as forensic capabilities expanded and legal standards evolved. This reassessment was not selective or reactive. It followed structured review programs aimed at determining whether preserved material from earlier years could now be examined with methods unavailable at the time of collection. Susan Berman's death was included in these reviews because the original investigation had been thoroughly documented and evidence had been maintained without compromise. The first step involved confirmation rather than action. Investigators reviewed storage logs, custody records, and prior laboratory reports to ensure continuity. This work was administrative in appearance, but essential in substance. Without verified integrity, no further examination could proceed responsibly. Attention then returned to material already in evidence. Nothing new was added. The reassessment focused on whether existing items could now be interpreted differently through validated techniques. Investigators consulted forensic specialists to evaluate potential options while weighing risks associated with consuming or altering preserved material. The handwritten note again became part of this evaluation, not because it had changed, but because analytical tools had. Earlier examinations were reviewed line by line to understand what had been tested, what had been ruled out, and what remained unexamined due to prior limits. This review avoided reinterpretation. It focused strictly on whether additional analysis was technically feasible and legally sound. Background documentation was reviewed in parallel. Financial records, travel documentation, and communication histories that had been examined years earlier were placed alongside forensic material to confirm consistency. This comparison was procedural rather than interpretive. Investigators sought alignment between timelines already established, not narrative meaning. Legal oversight remained constant. Prosecutors were consulted before any reassessment advanced. Standards for admissibility governed decision-making. Any action that could weaken evidentiary value was rejected. Investigators prioritized defensibility over experimentation. External attention increased during this period, but investigative direction did not follow it. Public interest can illuminate records, but it does not establish facts. Investigators maintained separation between renewed awareness and investigative action, ensuring that decisions remained grounded in documentation rather than attention. The reassessment process unfolded gradually. Some possibilities were eliminated after technical review. Others were deferred pending further validation of methods. This pacing reflected an understanding that partial or uncertain results could damage credibility rather than advance accountability. What distinguished this period from earlier inactivity was posture. The investigation was no longer defined solely by limitation. It was defined by readiness. Evidence had been preserved long enough for options to expand. Documentation was detailed enough to support renewed review without speculation. Throughout this work, language within records remained precise. Investigators avoided terms that implied direction or outcome. Notes reflected process rather than expectation. This discipline ensured continuity with earlier documentation and prevented distortion through hindsight. As reassessment continued, investigators identified specific areas where further action might be justified if conditions aligned. These areas were noted internally without announcement. Planning replaced urgency. Structure replaced pressure. The investigation did not move forward yet, but it no longer stood still. It occupied a narrow space between past limitation and future possibility, shaped by patience, restraint, and the careful maintenance of facts that had been recorded years earlier and never allowed to decay. What followed would depend on whether method and material could finally meet under standards that protected accuracy. Until then, the work remained quiet, deliberate, and anchored to the same evidence that had defined the investigation from the beginning, now viewed through a wider lens without rewriting its history. Public awareness surrounding Susan Berman's death returned gradually rather than suddenly. It did not begin with a police announcement or a filing in court. It emerged through renewed attention to long-documented material that had existed for years without producing action. The focus shifted not because facts had changed, but because they were being viewed together rather than in isolation. A documentary examination of events connected to Robert Durst assembled records that had previously been dispersed across files, transcripts, and prior reporting. This assembly did not create evidence. It placed existing information into a continuous sequence that drew broader notice. For law enforcement, the significance lay not in presentation, but in whether the material highlighted gaps or inconsistencies that warranted formal review. Investigators approached the renewed attention cautiously. Media exposure does not alter evidentiary standards. What it can do is prompt reassessment of whether previously examined material had been fully contextualized. That distinction guided how agencies responded. The review was internal, methodical, and grounded in documentation rather than reaction. One element receiving scrutiny involved recorded audio captured during documentary production. The recording contained remarks attributed to Robert Durst while he was unaware that a microphone remained active. Investigators did not treat the recording as revelation. They evaluated its origin, chain of custody, and authenticity. Any consideration of use depended on whether the material met legal requirements rather than public reaction. Forensic specialists and prosecutors reviewed how the audio had been obtained and preserved. Questions of admissibility required careful examination. Context mattered. Statements taken out of sequence can mislead. Investigators focused on whether the recording could be authenticated and whether it aligned with established facts rather than contradicting them. The renewed focus also led to re-examination of prior sworn testimony. Investigators compared earlier statements with later accounts, looking for factual alignment rather than contradiction. This work relied on transcripts, court filings, and documented interviews. Memory was not treated as reliable. Only recorded material guided analysis. Throughout this period, investigators maintained separation between documentary narrative and investigative decision-making. The documentary format emphasizes coherence. Investigative work emphasizes verification. This difference shaped how material was handled. Information that lacked evidentiary value was set aside, regardless of how prominently it appeared in public discussion. Legal strategy entered the picture as review progressed. Prosecutors assessed whether the assembled record could support formal action. This assessment involved weighing preserved physical evidence, prior documentation, and any newly evaluated material together rather than individually. The standard remained whether the evidence could support charges under law. Investigators revisited the handwritten note once more within this broader review. Its handling, preservation, and earlier analysis were examined to ensure that nothing had been mischaracterized. The note did not gain meaning through repetition. Its relevance depended on how it fit within a legally defensible framework. Public reaction during this period varied widely. Some viewed the renewed attention as overdue. Others questioned whether media influence could distort process. Investigators acknowledged this environment without engaging it. Their responsibility remained tied to records and statute, not perception. Communication between agencies increased as review continued. Coordination ensured that investigative steps aligned with prosecutorial thresholds. Decisions were documented carefully. Each action taken during this review was recorded to maintain continuity with earlier work. Importantly, restraint continued to define the investigation. No statements were issued that implied outcome. No actions were taken that could compromise later proceedings. Silence functioned as protection rather than avoidance. What changed during this period was not the evidence itself, but confidence that the existing record could now be examined as a whole under legal standards that supported action. This confidence did not arise from publicity. It arose from the realization that preserved material, when reviewed alongside authenticated documentation, could meet thresholds that had not been reachable before. The investigation moved forward quietly. Filings, motions, and internal review replaced inactivity. Documentary exposure receded from relevance as formal process took precedence. The work transitioned from reassessment to preparation, guided by law rather than narrative. Susan Berman's death remained defined by facts established years earlier. What shifted was the institutional readiness to act on those facts within legal bounds. The path ahead would be determined not by public attention, but whether the assembled record could now sustain accountability through judicial process. Movement within the investigation became visible only after groundwork had already been completed. Formal action did not begin with announcement or spectacle. It began with internal determination that the preserved record could now support legal steps that had not been possible earlier. Investigators and prosecutors reached this point through review rather than momentum. Attention centered on whether the assembled evidence met charging standards under California law. This evaluation required alignment between forensic findings, documentary material, and recorded statements. Each element was assessed for reliability, admissibility, and relevance. No single key carried the weight alone. The question was whether the totality could withstand scrutiny in court. Prosecutors reviewed the evidentiary file with care. They examined how the handwritten note, background documentation, and later reviewed material fit together procedurally. The focus remained on provable facts rather than narrative coherence. Charging decisions required confidence that evidence could be presented without reliance on inference. Investigators prepared detailed summaries outlining the investigative history. These summaries documented how evidence had been collected, preserved, and reassessed. They also addressed gaps and limitations openly. Transparency within the file mattered. Weaknesses needed to be acknowledged rather than obscured. Legal analysis considered venue, jurisdiction, and timing. Susan Berman had been killed in Los Angeles County, establishing where charges would be filed. Statutes governing murder allowed prosecution regardless of elapsed time. This legal framework made action possible even after years had passed. The decision to move forward involved coordination across agencies. Law enforcement ensured that records were complete and that custody documentation could be demonstrated. Prosecutors confirmed that filings would reflect evidence accurately without exaggeration. This coordination reduced risk of procedural challenge. When arrest action was authorized, it followed established process. Robert Durst was taken into custody based on the filed charge related to Susan Berman's death. The arrest did not mark conclusion. It marked transition from investigation to adjudication. Investigators understood that responsibility now shifted toward court proceedings governed by rules distinct from investigative review. Public notification followed arrest rather than preceding it. Authorities issued statements confirming the charge and outlining the basis in general terms. These statements avoided detailed commentary. They emphasized that allegations would be addressed through legal process rather than public discussion. The charging documents reflected restraint. They set out the alleged act, jurisdiction, and statutory basis without elaboration. Supporting affidavits summarized evidence in factual language. No conclusions beyond those required for charging were included. Reaction outside law enforcement varied. Some viewed the arrest as overdue. Others questioned timing and influence. Investigators did not respond to these views. Their role concluded with the transfer of responsibility to the courts. Public interpretation did not alter the evidentiary burden ahead. Following arrest, pre-trial procedures began. Robert Durst appeared before the court, and initial hearings addressed custody and scheduling. These proceedings were procedural rather than substantive. Evidence would be examined later through motions and trial. For investigators, this period involved preparation rather than pursuit. They organized records, coordinated with prosecutors, and ensured availability of witnesses and documentation. Years of preserved material now needed to be presented coherently within legal boundaries. The arrest demonstrated how investigative patience can intersect with legal readiness. Action occurred not because attention intensified, but because evidence reached a point where it could support formal accusation. This distinction mattered. It underscored that accountability emerged from process rather than pressure. Susan Berman's death entered a new phase of examination without altering established facts. What had been unresolved now faced judicial review. The investigation did not change direction. It changed venue. The work that followed would be shaped by evidentiary rules, adversarial testing, and judicial oversight, all grounded in material preserved long before arrest became possible. Once formal charges were filed, the focus shifted away from investigation and toward preparation for trial. The work no longer involved gathering new material. It involved determining how existing evidence could be presented, challenged, and tested within courtroom rules. This transition altered the pace and tone of the process without changing its factual foundation. Pre-trial proceedings unfolded through a series of hearings designed to establish boundaries. Judges considered motions related to evidence, procedure, and admissibility. Each motion required careful argument grounded in statute and precedent. Prosecutors sought to introduce material they believed essential to establishing responsibility. Defense counsel challenged scope, relevance, and method, arguing that certain evidence should be excluded or limited. One central area of dispute involved recorded material that had drawn public attention earlier. The court examined how that material had been obtained, whether it met legal standards for admission, and how it could be contextualized without prejudicing the proceedings. These determinations required technical review rather than narrative assessment. Authenticity, continuity, and relevance guided the court's decisions. The handwritten note also became the subject of legal scrutiny. Its admission depended on whether prosecutors could establish connection and probative value without relying on assumption. Arguments focused on how the note fit within the evidentiary framework rather than its symbolic weight. The court evaluated these arguments carefully, aware that written material can exert influence disproportionate to its factual role. Scheduling became complex. The volume of material required time for review by both sides. Continuances were requested and granted to allow preparation. These delays were procedural rather than strategic. The court balanced the need for thoroughness with the obligation to move proceedings forward. During this period, Robert Durst's health and custody status became relevant to scheduling and logistics. Filings addressed fitness to proceed and accommodations required for participation. These considerations were handled through medical documentation and judicial oversight, ensuring that proceedings complied with legal standards. Media coverage intensified as hearings progressed. Reporting focused on filings, rulings, and visible moments in court. Investigators and prosecutors maintained limited public communication, recognizing that pre-trial commentary could compromise fairness. The courtroom became the proper venue for argument. Legal strategy on both sides reflected the complexity of a case built over many years. Prosecutors organized evidence chronologically to demonstrate continuity. Defense counsel emphasized gaps, delays, and the absence of direct eyewitness testimony. Each approach relied on the same record, but framed it differently. Judicial rulings during this stage shaped the contours of the trial to come. Decisions about what evidence could be presented and how established parameters that neither side could exceed. These rulings did not determine outcome, they determined process. Witness lists were finalized. Experts prepared to explain forensic findings and record analysis. Lay witnesses were identified to provide context where appropriate. Subpoenas ensured availability. This preparation required coordination across agencies and careful review of prior statements to ensure consistency. Throughout pre-trial proceedings, the emphasis remained on law rather than narrative. Arguments were technical. Language was precise. Emotional framing was avoided by the court. This restraint reinforced the distinction between public interest and judicial responsibility. For those observing from outside, the length and complexity of pre-trial activity underscored how delayed accountability changes legal dynamics. Time expands records and complicates logistics. It also requires patience from all involved. By the close of pre-trial proceedings, the structure of the trial had been set. Evidence would be presented within defined limits. Arguments would be tested through cross-examination and judicial instruction. The groundwork for adjudication was complete. Susan Berman's death now stood before the court not as an unresolved matter, but as an allegation supported by preserved documentation and forensic analysis. What followed would depend on how that material was examined under oath and evaluated by a jury within a system designed to weigh proof rather than possibility. The courtroom work unfolded through accumulation rather than revelation. Proceedings moved forward by placing documented material into a public record governed by rules that favored precision over emphasis. What had been preserved across years now had to be explained, tested, and weighed in a setting designed to measure reliability. Prosecutors began by establishing foundational facts. They presented records confirming Susan Berman's death inside her home, the cause of death, and the absence of forced entry. Medical findings were introduced to show how she died and to anchor timing. These points were not contested as events, they were presented to frame the evidence that followed. The handwritten note entered the record through procedural steps that emphasized authentication. Experts described how the note had been received, stored, and examined. The focus stayed on physical characteristics, chain of custody, and comparison methods. Interpretation was limited to what could be supported through analysis. The note's existence was established without assigning narrative meaning beyond its documented features. Forensic evidence was addressed methodically. Analysts explained how items had been collected, preserved, and later examined. They outlined testing methods and limitations, clarifying what the evidence could show and what it could not. Statistical measures were described to ensure that jurors understood how conclusions were reached without overstating certainty. Witness testimony provided context drawn from records rather than recollection. Individuals connected to documentation explained how records were created and maintained. Financial transactions were presented through authenticated documents. Timelines were supported by logs and verified entries rather than memory. This approach emphasized traceable information. The relationship between Susan Berman and Robert Durst was addressed through documented interactions. Prosecutors introduced records that showed contact and financial ties. These materials were offered to establish association and access. Care was taken to avoid speculation. The presentation focused on what records demonstrated rather than why actions occurred. Recorded audio that had drawn attention earlier was introduced under court supervision. Experts described how the recording had been captured and preserved. Authentication addressed whether the audio had been altered. Jurors were instructed on how to consider such material within evidentiary limits. The emphasis remained on admissibility and context. Defense counsel responded by challenging scope and interpretation. Cross-examination focused on gaps, timing, and alternative explanations consistent with the evidence. Experts were questioned about margins of error and methodological limits. This questioning did not introduce new facts, it tested strength and reliability of what had been presented. Throughout proceedings, the court managed pacing and boundaries. Objections were ruled upon with reference to statute and precedent. Instructions clarified how jurors should weigh evidence. The process underscored that proof emerges through examination rather than assertion. The length of the trial reflected the breadth of material accumulated over time. Records spanning decades required explanation without compression. The court allowed space for that explanation while maintaining order. Jurors were provided with tools to track information without guidance toward outcome. Visual exhibits were used sparingly. When presented, they served to orient rather than persuade. Charts summarized timelines already supported by documents. Images referenced items already described through testimony. The intent was clarity, not impact. Expert witnesses explained technical matters in plain terms. DNA analysis was described step by step. Laboratory protocols were outlined. The limitations of testing were stated alongside results. This balance was essential to prevent misunderstanding. As the presentation continued, the structure remained consistent. Evidence was introduced, authenticated, examined, and challenged. No single element stood alone. The prosecution relied on cumulative weight. The defense emphasized absence of direct observation and the passage of time. Judicial instructions reinforced neutrality. Jurors were reminded that association does not equal responsibility. They were instructed to consider each piece of evidence on its own and in relation to the whole. Emotional response was not part of the standard. The trial did not hinge on a singular dramatic moment. It advanced through careful placement of material into a legal framework. The process favored completeness over speed. That choice reflected the age and complexity of the record. As days passed, the jury received a comprehensive view of preserved evidence and documented relationships. The proceedings demonstrated how delayed accountability reshapes presentation. Time requires explanation. Explanation requires patience. By the close of evidence, the record stood assembled in public view. What had existed across files and reports now existed within sworn testimony and admitted exhibits. The courtroom phase did not reinterpret the past. It subjected the preserved past to formal testing under rules designed to separate possibility from proof. When the presentation of evidence concluded, responsibility shifted fully to the jury. The courtroom entered a quieter interval defined by deliberation rather than argument. Jurors were instructed on the law, the elements required for conviction, and the standards governing their evaluation of proof. They were reminded to consider the evidence collectively and to separate documented facts from speculation. Deliberations unfolded away from public view. Jurors reviewed exhibits, testimony, and instructions provided by the court. The length of the process reflected the volume and complexity of material introduced during trial. Records spanning many years required careful consideration. The task was not to reconstruct events imaginatively, but to decide whether the evidence presented met the legal threshold required for a verdict. When deliberations concluded, the jury returned to the courtroom and delivered its decision. Robert Durst was found guilty of first-degree murder in connection with Susan Berman's death. The verdict reflected the jury's determination that the prosecution had established responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt based on the evidence presented. The verdict did not conclude proceedings. Sentencing followed under California law, guided by statutory requirements rather than discretion alone. The court considered the conviction, the nature of the offense, and applicable sentencing provisions. Victim impact state. When the presentation of evidence concluded, responsibility shifted fully to the jury. The courtroom entered a quieter interval defined by deliberation rather than argument. Jurors were instructed on the law, the elements required for conviction, and the standards governing their evaluation of proof. They were reminded to consider the evidence collectively and to separate documented facts from speculation. Deliberations unfolded away from public view. Jurors reviewed exhibits, testimony, and instructions provided by the court. The length of the process reflected the volume and complexity of material introduced during trial. Records spanning many years required careful consideration. The task was not to reconstruct events imaginatively, but to decide whether the evidence presented met the legal threshold required for a verdict. When deliberations concluded, the jury returned to the courtroom and delivered its decision. Robert Durst was found guilty of first-degree murder in connection with Susan Berman's death. The verdict reflected the jury's determination that the prosecution had established responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt based on the evidence presented. The verdict did not conclude proceedings. Sentencing followed under California law, guided by statutory requirements rather than discretion alone. The court considered the conviction, the nature of the offense, and applicable sentencing provisions. Victim impact statements were presented in accordance with procedure, allowing family members to address the court within defined limits. The judge imposed a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence aligned with statutory mandates for the offense, as determined by the jury. The court explained the basis for the sentence in legal terms, referencing the verdict and the governing law, rather than broader commentary. Following sentencing, Robert Durst was remanded to custody to serve the imposed term. The legal process moved into a post-conviction phase governed by appellate rules. Notices of appeal were filed, as permitted under law. These filings preserved the right to review, but did not alter the conviction or sentence at that time. Public response to the verdict and sentence was immediate. Coverage focused on the length of time between Susan Berman's death and the courtroom outcome. Reporting emphasized the role of preserved evidence, forensic analysis, and procedural persistence. Authorities limited public comment, reiterating that the verdict resulted from evidence tested through trial rather than external influence. The court record expanded to include post-trial motions and filings. These documents addressed procedural matters rather than factual disputes. The conviction stood unless altered through appellate review, a process that follows its own timeline and standards. The verdict and sentence represented a rare instance in which a decades-old killing reached judicial conclusion. The outcome did not change the facts of Susan Berman's death. It established accountability through formal adjudication rather than inference. This distinction mattered within the justice system. For investigators and prosecutors, the verdict confirmed that decisions made years earlier to preserve evidence and document actions accurately had allowed the matter to be examined fully in court. The process demonstrated how long dormant investigations can reach resolution when evidence withstands scrutiny. The legal system moved forward methodically. Appeals would be handled through written briefs and judicial review, rather than courtroom testimony. Custody and medical considerations for the defendant were addressed through correctional procedures rather than trial proceedings. Susan Berman's death now occupied a different position within public record. It was no longer unresolved or pending. It had been examined through adversarial process and decided by a jury applying legal standards. The verdict reflected that determination without reference to narrative or symbolism. The courtroom phase concluded without ceremony. Documents were filed, custody transferred. The record stood complete in its judicial form, defined by verdict and sentence rather than uncertainty, and carried forward into the appellate system as required by law. After sentencing, the legal process entered a narrower channel governed by appellate procedure and custody management. The focus moved away from fact-finding and toward review. Court filings addressed whether trial proceedings had complied with legal standards. These filings did not introduce new evidence. They examined how existing material had been handled, presented, and ruled upon. Appeals followed established rules. Written briefs outlined alleged procedural errors and arguments for reconsideration. Prosecutors responded with filings defending the conviction and sentence. Judges reviewed the record as it existed, relying on transcripts, admitted exhibits, and prior rulings. This stage unfolded without witnesses or testimony, shaped entirely by documentation. During this period, Robert Durst remained in custody. His health became an administrative consideration rather than a matter for trial. Medical records and evaluations informed decisions about care and accommodation within the correctional system. These issues were handled through correctional and judicial channels rather than public proceedings. The conviction remained in effect while appellate review proceeded. No ruling altered the verdict or sentence during this time. The legal status of the judgment stayed intact, subject to ongoing review as permitted by law. In January 2022, Robert Durst died while in custody. His death was confirmed through official statements. With his passing, the appellate process ended. Courts cannot continue review when the defendant is deceased. The conviction stood as entered, and no further legal action could occur. Authorities documented the impact of his death on the legal record. The sentence could no longer be carried out, but the verdict remained part of judicial history. The distinction between enforcement and adjudication mattered. Enforcement ends with death. Adjudication remains recorded. Public reporting reflected this clarification. Coverage noted that the conviction was not vacated. The judicial finding remained valid. Susan Berman's death had been examined, argued, and decided through trial. That outcome did not change with Robert Durst's death. For the justice system, this point marked procedural closure. There would be no further hearings, appeals, or rulings. The record was complete in its legal form. What followed was administrative finalization rather than judicial action. Law enforcement agencies updated records to reflect the end of proceedings. Evidence remained archived according to retention policies. Documentation preserved the investigative and judicial history. These records ensured that the path from discovery to conviction remained traceable. The public response to Robert Durst's death varied. Some focused on the length of time between Susan Berman's death and final accountability. Others focused on the fact that imprisonment did not extend further. Authorities did not frame the outcome in emotional terms. They reiterated that the judicial process had reached its endpoint. Susan Berman's death no longer occupied a position of legal uncertainty. The conviction had established responsibility through formal process. Robert Durst's death did not reopen questions of guilt or procedure. It closed the remaining administrative avenues. The conclusion of appellate review underscored how time shapes justice differently at each stage. Investigation depends on preservation. Trial depends on admissibility. Appeal depends on record. Death ends all three. What remains is documentation and the clarity it provides. With no further legal steps possible, the focus shifted away from courtrooms and filings. The matter moved fully into historical record, defined by investigation, trial, conviction, and the end of proceedings brought on by circumstances beyond judicial control. What remains after the courts fall silent is not an ending shaped by emotion, but a record shaped by process. Susan Berman's death moved through every stage the justice system allows, from discovery to investigation, from delay to prosecution, and finally to conviction. Each step was governed by rules that did not bend to time, attention, or expectation. One of the clearest lessons rests in evidence handling. Decisions made in the first hours after discovery influenced what became possible decades later. Preservation was not dramatic, it was procedural. Items were logged, stored, and revisited without alteration. That discipline allowed later review to rely on material integrity rather than memory. Without it, the outcome would have been structurally impossible. The investigation also illustrates the limits of early certainty. Associations, reputation, and public narratives existed long before formal action. Investigators resisted converting those elements into conclusions. That restraint delayed resolution, but it protected credibility. Accountability achieved through speculation does not endure. Accountability achieved through verified process does. Time played a dual role. It obscured opportunity while expanding capacity. Early forensic tools could not interpret what later methods could. The system did not fail during those years. It waited. The ability to wait without discarding responsibility reflects institutional maturity rather than inertia. Media attention intersected with the investigation without replacing it. Documentary exposure assembled information, but law enforcement action followed legal thresholds rather than public reaction. This separation mattered. When investigations respond to attention rather than evidence, outcomes weaken. In this instance, review followed documentation, not momentum. The courtroom proceedings underscored how delayed justice reshapes trial structure. Evidence accumulated over years requires explanation without compression. Jurors were asked to evaluate material created across different eras under a single standard. That task required patience and clarity rather than persuasion. The verdict did not resolve loss, it resolved responsibility. Those outcomes are not the same. The justice system addresses conduct and proof, not grief. Recognizing that distinction prevents misplaced expectations about what courts can provide. Robert Durst's death closed remaining procedural avenues without altering the judicial finding. The conviction remained intact. This outcome highlights another boundary. Courts adjudicate while individuals are alive. Death ends participation, not record. The system documents truth where possible, and stops where it must. Institutionally, the investigation demonstrates the value of continuity. Personnel changed, technology changed, standards evolved. The record endured because documentation replaced reliance on individuals. This continuity allowed later actors to engage responsibly with earlier work. The story also reflects how unresolved deaths linger within systems, even when public attention fades. Responsibility does not expire when progress stalls. It becomes custodial. Files remain active in memory even when inactive in action. That quiet stewardship enabled later movement without reconstruction. No part of this outcome depended on a single decision or discovery. It depended on alignment. Evidence, method, and law converged slowly. That convergence did not produce a dramatic turning point. It produced viability. Susan Berman's death now exists within public record as an examined act rather than an unanswered one. The path to that point was uneven, extended, and restrained. It did not follow narrative expectation. It followed procedure. What this investigation ultimately shows is how accountability emerges through accumulation rather than revelation. Accuracy depends on patience. Process depends on restraint. Justice depends on limits as much as it depends on action. The record remains. It does not ask for interpretation beyond what it contains. It stands as documentation of how institutions function when time intervenes, when certainty is delayed, and when resolution arrives not through urgency, but through endurance.